scriptures up here that I can make sure to get for you too. But otherwise, you can look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. You can just look at it in your pew Bible. And maybe what we'll do is I'll have someone, if someone would be willing to start off, we'll read it. And maybe we'll read it, we could probably read it in, let's say, 3 parts again. If we have someone read 1 through 5, and then, let's say, 6 through 8, and then 10 through 13. So we've got Bruce again. We'll have you do 1 through 5, or 1 through 5. Who wants to do 6 through 8? Any volunteers? All right, Jerry and then Jane will finish us off. So Bruce, start 1 through 6, and then, or 1 through 5, and then Jerry do 6 through 9, or 6 through 8, and then Jane do 9 through the end. And all right, so I'm going to have us, hey, let's flip to the next slide. I'm going to have us do what we've been doing here. I'll give you maybe 3 to 5 minutes to go through and look for, I think what I'd suggest that you focus on is looking for the repeated words, because that's always a good clue to what the meaning of the text is. And then this one will be a little, I think a little easier in one sense, a little more difficult on another, but then look for Old Testament references and see if you can jot down or note anything about what the Old Testament reference might be alluding to. And go ahead and work in groups if you'd like, work with a couple people next to you. So look for those repeated words. If there are any grammar details that you can find as well, go ahead and look for those as well. And then in Old Testament, the Old Testament reference, see what you can make of that. I'll give you maybe 3 to 5 minutes to do that. So go ahead and get started on that. one more minute or so. All right, what did you come up with? What words did you see or notice that are repeated a few times throughout this passage? Okay, the yeast. That's right, and that's an Old Testament reference, isn't it? That's a what is it referring back to, Doris? Do you remember? That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit because that's really that Old Testament story becomes key to Paul's understanding of how the church ought to live and deal with sin in its midst. So I'll say a little more about that in a minute, but that's right. So it's verses about 7 through 8. 7 and 8 talk about the reference to the yeast in the Old Testament. So good. Um, what else? Other repeated words or phrases or ideas that show up a few times? Yeah, Jerry. Sexual immorality. Yeah, I counted at least 4 times where that in the Greek that would be one word, and that's obviously the kind of the key problem that Paul is getting at here. And we'll come back to that more in a minute as well. Other words, yeah, Cheryl. Yes, right. The difference between how do you deal with sin as a church within versus how do we engage with the world. And Paul makes a distinction there that it seems the Corinthians missed, and so he needs to clarify that. Good. Anything else? Judging. Yeah, that's right. So how do we judge sin? What does that look like? And then Paul's judgment on the Corinthians as well. In verse 3 there, he says, I want you to assume that I'm present with you and deal with this as if I were right there with you by judging this sin. And then he revisits that, like Cheryl said, judging those on the outside. So how we judge internally is different than how do we judge in the world out there. Good. Okay, Haley. Any other ones that you want? Purge the evil. Yes, yes, yes. That's good. That's right. Good. That's good. Yeah. You've got an eye for the Old Testament passages, Bruce. You've got notes in your Bible. Well, hey, you know what? That's how we spot them, right? I mean, that's what those footnotes are there for. So, Haley, would you go to the next slide, and let's see if we can figure out a little more about the Corinthian problem. As Jerry pointed out, the issue was sexual immorality. Um, I'll sort of take a little risk here. Put the picture up. Does anyone remember what that is a picture of? I showed this like a few months ago. Yeah, it's the canal. It's the Corinthian Canal, and it sort of it didn't exist in Paul's day. By the way, it's about 100 years old, but it's a canal that bridges two major seas. And in Paul's day, what you'd have to do is the ship would pull into one port, and it would take about a day or even up to a week to haul the goods across the land and then put them in the port on the other side, and then you could keep going. But what that meant was that you had people from all over the world coming into Corinth, and they would end up staying there for a day or 3 or 4 and doing business there. So Corinth was a very cosmopolitan city, and as exciting as that might be if you were living back then, um, it also meant that it brought all kinds of religious practices and immorality that were kind of imported into the city. You get all these sailors and that, and I don't mean anything disparaging about sailors, but that's just how it worked. You get these sailors coming into port, and they brought with them a lot of sexual immorality. And what was happening, what is Paul describing happening in the Corinthian church now? What do you hear him saying if you listen carefully in verses like 1 and 2? What's he identifying? Worse than what the pagans were doing, that's right. So somehow the church has not only adapted to the world, but they've gotten worse than what the world is like. And Paul tells us what it was. Our English sort of uses a euphemism, but he says a man has his father's wife. He's talking about an incestuous relationship, probably between someone and his stepmother. It's not clear to me whether this was a widespread problem or if it was just one individual in the church. I don't know. But in any case, it seems, I guess if I had to pick one side of the scale to land on, I'd say it seems like it was one person, because he seems to be saying, judge that person. But in any case, it might have been more widespread than that. But Paul says this is a real serious thing, because the world is looking at you, and you're behaving worse than the world. The world is even grossed out by what you're doing, is what Paul is getting at. What is the related problem that Paul identifies here? He talks about the sexual immorality and then the incestuous relationship, but then he goes on and he points out a related thing. Yeah, Jane, and then Paul's authority mean. Okay. Okay, good. Right. Paul is really saying, you Corinthians are taking when the cat's away, the mouse will play kind of thing, right? When I'm not there, you just act like you can do whatever. Yeah, that's good. That's a part of it. What else, Debbie? You were going to say something? Hmm. Right. That's right. So the permissiveness of the attitude, right? So lack of respect for Paul's authority and presence, and kind of we can do whatever we want while Paul's away. And then the permissiveness of the whole church, that they're just going to kind of tolerate it. I think I saw, Jim, your hand go up as well. That's right. That's right. Look also at verse 2. And Paul says, what does he say? Because he repeats this as well, although it's not the same word. Verse 2, what does Paul say about their attitude about this? How does he describe it? What was, Tracy? Say it again. They're proud. Yeah, they're boasting. They don't care. Yeah, and he picks up on that again in verse 6. So, in other words, when this church sees the worst of all sins in their midst, not only are they tolerant, not only are they permissive, not only do they disrespect Paul, but they're bragging about it. It's kind of, they take some kind of twisted pride in how sinful this church has become, and so Paul is really upset about that. Okay, let's go. Well, and maybe that's just kind of a good question to ask too. When we think about sin, what does Paul want our posture to be towards sin that we might find? Like when we recognize sin in the lives of others, how ought we to view that? Do you think? Right. Yeah, that's right. That's a key distinction. So let's narrow it down. If we're looking at sin within the church, right? And even before we talk about what steps should we take, I guess what I'm trying to get at is what should the posture of our heart be? We must not ignore it. What else? Mourning it and grieving it, right? Because Paul says, second part of there, verse 2, ought you not rather to mourn over this, right? In other words, I guess I bring that up because I know that when we see sin, whether it's in the world or whether it's in the church, we can go in a lot of different directions with that, right? Sometimes it's pride, like, oh, I would never do that. Look how bad those people are. Sometimes it's harsh and judgmental. Sometimes it's indifference. But I'm not sure so often our default reaction is grief and mourning over it. And that kind of struck me, I guess, that Paul sees this sin and it grieves his heart, and he says you ought to be grieving over the presence of sin. Right? It's in other words, yes, you have to deal with it, and he's going to get to that, but he also says the attitude of our hearts has to be one of great sadness over the destructive power of sin and what it does for the reputation of the church in the world, and how it it's just so destructive. So that kind of jumped out at me. I thought I'd just kind of bring that to our attention because I'm not sure that I always think of it that in those terms. But grief, Paul says. Okay, next slide there, Haley. And I guess we kind of answered the question there in the red box. And so in the green one, how does Paul instruct the church to address the sin in the life of the church? So let's break this down. Paul's giving instructions for dealing with sin in the church, and then he also kind of gets at it with sin in the world. But what does Paul tell the Corinthian church they need to do with this individual who is engaging in this sin and proud of it and boasting? What do they need to do? What steps do they need to take? Say it one. Be very. Yes, that's right. Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So I did a little work with that because it says, for the destruction of the flesh so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Now let me just throw that out to you. What do you make of that? Because it took me a little bit to kind of wrap my mind around what I think Paul is getting at. But what do you think Paul has in mind when he says, deliver them over so that their flesh might be destroyed and their spirit might be saved? What do you see? Hmm. Hmm. Yep. Right. So we have to address it for the purpose of dealing with the root problem. Yep, that's right. What else? Yeah, Jane. Yeah. Right. Y- That's right. It's a visible depiction of what is happening, what appears to be happening internally. Somehow this person is, not acting in line with the gospel, and so they need to say, listen, you need to, we need to identify this. This is the church can't just sort of tolerate this, right? What? Yeah, Margie. Right. In fact, that's the whole point and the whole purpose is restoration here. Now, let me just make a little comment on the idea of the destruction of the flesh, because that's where my mind got a little puzzled on that. Yeah, Jane. Yeah, that's how I think that's what it is. I think because when you read that, it sounds almost like Paul is saying physically this guy's going to be destroyed somehow, or in the end times destroyed. No, but I think what Paul is using when he uses the destruction of the flesh, he means the sinful nature needs to be destroyed, so that in the end his spirit might be saved. In other words, we're not Gnostics here, which is was an old teaching that said, your body doesn't really matter; it's just your spirit. And so Paul is somehow kind of saying, let the body, fall apart. Who cares? Let's save the spirit. It's more let the old nature, the old sinful nature, be put to death, because that's what we all need to do, so that in the end, this person might be saved and he might be, redeemed and forgiven. Yeah, Debbie. Yeah, I'd have to go back and check, but I think that sounds right. And Jane's nodding her head too. So it's, it's, right, right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So there's a fascinating picture of church leadership. Right? You've got to deal with sin seriously, but then also there's a quickness to forgive and to restore and to welcome back. And Paul's desire here is motivated entirely by this person's standing with God, and he doesn't want this person. It's not vindictive. It's we need to deal with this severely for the purpose of restoration, and that's what Paul is after there. Yeah. Okay. Uh, what is okay? We got what is the goal? So here let's touch on this real briefly, and we're kind of dancing around the Old Testament stuff. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but because that's the foundation. The Old Testament allusion is Paul's theological grounding for these instructions. So first of all, he says you got to deal with the person, put them out so that they might be restored. Keep them at, discipline them so that they might be restored. But then In verse 9, Paul offers some clarification. Now, this seems to be where we are missing a letter from Paul, perhaps, because he says, I wrote to you not to associate with the sexually immoral. And it seems that the church took that very, very literally. And they said, okay, well, then we're going to have nothing to do with anybody in the world. And so they were kind of confused about that, and they write back to Paul. How does Paul respond? What does he say to the church about how they deal with people who are in the world who are, sinful? What does he say? Debbie? Yes. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Right. Who profess Christ and yet contradicted entirely with a willful sin. Um, so he clarifies this, and I'm with you. I'm glad that he adds this, because if we were to, if we could not identify with any sinful people, where would we go? I mean, right? So Paul's saying, look, I realize that the world is kind of a messy place, and you're going to be dealing with people who are sinful and sexually immoral, and lists a lot of other things: greed, idolatry, revilers, drunkards, swindlers. Paul says, look, I know you're going to be dealing with these people because that's what the world is like. I'm not telling you to get out of the world. I'm just saying how you deal within the church is different than in the world. And I'm glad for that clarification too, right? It helps. What else? Anything else that you'd want to add about Paul's instructions given for how does the church deal with the world? Sure. Yeah. Which verse are you referring to? Verse 11 there. Yeah. We can be. Yeah, we're in that section. Sure. Yeah. No, that's fine. That's fine. Mhm. 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 Right. Yeah, right. I think most specifically, so I'll say two things on that. I think number one, hospitality was a huge virtue in Middle Eastern culture, still is today. Hospitality was more than just having people over for coffee, although that's a pretty good way to show hospitality. But it was, you invite people in and you really embrace them, and it was a sign of acceptance. And so I think Paul is cautioning, I think big picture, Paul is cautioning about just being the church that shows hospitality in such a way that gives the message that we just accept you. But I think more specifically, he has probably in mind the Lord's Supper. So I think he's saying when you come, because later on he's going to come back to that theme, back in about, I think, chapter 11. I think that's a chapter. He's going to say a lot more about the communion table, and I think that's probably the main thing he has in mind, where if you welcome him to the Lord's table and you share the meal of, Christ's body and blood, you are really sending the wrong message, right? Because that was a big meal. Yeah. It, right. It wasn't the little glasses and it was a big thing. In fact, the Lord's Supper was usually celebrated as, it seems, as part of like what we would have today as a potluck. You'd have a meal together and then you'd share the Lord's Supper at the meal. And so I think that's the main thing that Paul has in mind there about don't share the Lord's Supper because they are unrepentant in their sin. And that's a good clarification too, because Paul is not saying that people have to be perfect in order to come to the Lord's table or to not be judged. This is unrepentance, and that's the sin that Paul is, that's underneath all of this. It's not just sexual immorality, it's unrepentant and boastful sexual immorality. Okay, Haley's ahead of me, so let's get to the theology underneath this. And I thought to do this because the grounding for all of this, the main basis for Paul giving these instructions about putting out the sexually immoral people and the unrepentant is Paul comes back in verse, where is it? Verse 7, 6 through 8. And he starts talking about leavening the lump and the Passover lamb, and we're thinking, right, what is he getting at? And here's where you have to know a little Old Testament stuff. And of course, Paul's audience, many of them would have known their Old Testament better than we do. But thankfully we have the Old Testament, so we can study it a little bit and figure out what he's getting at. But I thought I'd just tell you a little story here. I have here, this is a binding contract. It's now null and void because the date has passed. But Um, about 8 years ago, I signed this contract to buy all the yeast from the Jewish community here in Salem. So, and it's a Chemetz bill of sale. Now, Cheryl, I'll let you decide how legal and binding it actually is now. But here's what happens. So, when the Jewish community prepares to celebrate Passover, one of the things they have to do is get rid of all the yeast in their home, and they've been doing that since way back when, Old Testament times, and they continue to do that today. Well, it turns out it's kind of difficult to get rid of all the yeast in your home nowadays. You got bread and crackers and all kinds of other things. Maybe you don't even realize that you have it. And if you stock, you go buy groceries and then you have to throw a bunch of it out. Well, that doesn't seem so good. So what they do is they sign over all of their yeast to the temple, to the rabbi in the temple community, and then the temple community signs a contract with another person in the community, in this case it was me, to buy all that yeast and to own it legally for the period of the Passover and unleavened bread. So it says, be it known that for the payment in the sum of $1, the full receipt of which is acknowledged, the undersigned Rabbi James Green, the seller, hereby sells and transfers to Reverend Rob Toornstra, the buyer, the following: Chemetz, the leavened products and all products containing grains which are already fermented, of the members of Temple Beth Shalom, as authorized by their signed power of attorney for sale of Chemetz forms. And then it lists all the sellers, the conditions and so on, but it says, the signed power of attorney for the sale of the Chemetz form shall be kept by the synagogue office and will be made available to the buyer. Upon the condition of the Passover holiday, all Chemetz will revert to their previous owner unless further action is taken. So my understanding of that is that if I wanted to, I could have gone to the temple and said, hand over the list. And I could have gotten a list of all the people whose bread I legally owned. And then after Passover, then it reverted back to the original seller. So that's their way today of cleansing all the yeast from their homes. And it's a binding contract. I guess they still do it today here. You can, I don't know who does it now, who buys it now, but I did that about 8 years ago. And it carries back, it's a tradition that does date back all the way to the Old Testament, to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread happened always in conjunction with the Passover. And so those two feasts would happen together. I think Passover came first, then unleavened bread, although I think that's how it went. Anyways, and what the Feast of the Unleavened Bread was, it was getting rid of all the yeast in your home, but it was a way of remembering the affliction that the Israelites suffered in Egypt, and then their deliverance, and it was kind of a way of reminding them that, yes, they had to leave very quickly out of Egypt, but it was also a way of reminding them of their suffering and affliction while they were in Egypt. So the idea of yeast became associated with their old life in slavery in Egypt. Those two things became kind of linked together. And so by getting rid of yeast, what it was actually doing was it was sort of a symbolic way of getting rid of the old sinful nature. And so that's why Paul talks about here in 1 Corinthians 5, he talks about getting rid of the old yeast, the old leaven. It's really Paul's way of saying get rid of the sin out of your life, get rid of the old nature out of your life. Now, what's important to remember is that Passover and unleavened bread were always celebrated right together. And that's important because Passover was remembering that God had set the people free from slavery in Egypt. They had been delivered. God broke the bondage of the Egyptians, so now they are a freed people. But then in conjunction with that, they had to learn to live like freed people. So the unleavened